Hi everybody, thanks for joining us at the end of a busy day, no doubt. This is Jon Glasby and Robin Miller talking about population health management in the context of the broader relationship between the NHS and local government. I'm going to kick off talking about that broader relationship, and a little bit later on Robin's going to talk about the importance of place and the role of health and wellbeing boards in particular. What we were hoping to achieve in the session was focus initially on the relationship between the NHS and local government, the importance of joint working, inter-agency collaboration, and how we coordinate care around the needs of people who may have multiple needs or complex needs. We wanted to cover why local government matters to population health management. We were going to talk a little bit about relationships that are based more upon place than may have been the case in the past. And then in particular, we were going to focus on health and wellbeing boards, both as an example of some of this and as a vehicle for how we can think about working together differently around populations and around places in future. In terms of the partnership working between the NHS and local government, that's long been a policy priority. Some of that stems from the fact that real life, as we said on the slide, is kind of more complicated and more messy than the structures that we create in our welfare services. We've probably all been in situations at work and indeed with private individuals where we're dealing with silo-based systems or services that don't join up around our needs when they interconnect. And the welfare services that we've inherited have been based on single central government departments and then regional and local delivery arms that often aren't designed with integrated care and joined up working in mind. So real life is more complicated and more messy than the structures that we create in our welfare systems and our organisational charts. And that's long been recognised, probably since the beginning of the welfare state, but in particular since the emphasis of the old New Labour government on joined up solutions to joined up problems, to holistic care, to bringing down the Berlin Wall between health and social services, or to more recent emphasis on integrated care and seamless person-centred services. When we talk about partnership working though, the focus has often been on the relationship between the health service, as if the health service is a single entity, and on adult social care, rather than social care more generally, or in particular for today's purposes, the broader range of local government functions. And that's probably as true of adult social care as it is of the NHS. One of the ironies is that although the relationship between adult social care and the NHS can sometimes be difficult, health and social care often have more in common with each other than social care has in common with some of the other departments and directorates in the same local authority. Our experience over many years is that NHS understanding of how local government works is limited, and indeed vice versa. Although we've all become senior in our different services and systems, we've often done that by specialising and becoming expert in our own parts of the process. And we may have quite low levels of understanding of the partner agency. When I'm working with a joint health and social care audience, I spend quite a lot of time sometimes talking to people about what a council is and how it works and how local elections operate and how council tax works and business rates and how different directorates of a council relate to other directorates and the difference between adult and children's social care services and how that's governed and the kind of policy framework around both adults and children's services and so on and so forth. And there are NHS equivalents of all those things, but we often understand relatively little about each other's worlds, in my experience. And because the day job is so busy, we often don't get the chance to shadow colleagues in partner organisations and to understand more about the detail of what they do. So my contention, I guess, is that it's possible to become quite senior in the NHS or quite senior in local government and actually understand relatively little about how the other partner agency works. And I guess the key, the final bullet point on this slide, the key backdrop to this is the financial context, which, however difficult it is in the health service, given the service and the financial pressures that we face, is even more challenging in local government, given the extent of the funding cuts that we see. Excuse me. And the very real pressures that is creating. One local government leader described the cuts that they are experiencing as the end of local government as we know it. And although most councils have tried to prioritise adult social care and children's services as best they can, that's meant even more severe cuts everywhere else, and B, the level of the pressure we're under means that there's still been a significant impact on adult social care and children's services, and that looks set to continue. Of course, when that happens, financial pressure can force us further apart as we each become more focused on our own organisational must-dos, or it can force us closer together because doing things separately isn't an option if it ever was. Where there's duplication, we can't afford to do some things one time over, let alone afford to do them twice over. So financial pressure can both pull us further apart and make it harder to work together, but it can also be a spur to come together and to do things in different ways, because carrying on as we are simply isn't an option. And in one sense, how we choose to respond to that is partly a choice. We could choose to take it one way or the other. In terms of why local government matters for today's discussion, and in terms of population health management, most of the functions that affect population health don't sit within the health service. They're actually local government functions. So if we want to improve the health and well-being of an area, that conversation has to involve local government. There's also the importance of local democratic accountability, which is very different to the forms of accountability that exist within the health service. In my spare time, I'm an NHS non-executive director, and there are particular kinds of accountability associated with that role, but it's very different to the kind of accountability that a locally democratically elected councillor has. And the relationship I have to key stakeholders is different to that relationship that the councillor may have with local people and with local taxpayers as well. And we'll come on to the issue of accountability shortly, because for us it's crucial. Local government, as well, as I'll say in the next slide, is often part and parcel of people's sense of place and their sense of identity. And that in itself is an important source of legitimacy when we're taking potentially very difficult decisions and trying to bring local people and key stakeholders along with us. And I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. At the same time, though, there's a danger of focusing just on social care, and within that, focusing just on adult social care. And within that, focusing just on older people, forgetting some of the work that social care does, for example, with carers, with people with learning disabilities, with people with physical impairments, people with mental health problems, and so on. And there's also probably a danger of focusing on what social care can do for the NHS. And although debates about delayed transfers of care from hospital is a really legitimate and important debate, there is a danger that we see social care solely in terms of how it can facilitate quicker and better discharges from hospital, transfers of care, rather than appreciating the full range of things that social care, adult social care, and indeed broader local government do. So trying to focus on that intensity of the relationship between adult social care and the NHS, but also seeing the broader local government context, is really important. Moving on to discussions about place, we've argued for some time that there's a real opportunity for a new relationship. We sometimes describe this in terms of creating NHS local, or moving beyond joint commissioning. And by that, we don't mean that joint commissioning is unimportant. Clearly it's crucial. But often as I travel around the country, it feels almost as if the entirety of the relationship between local governments and the local NHS is vested in a small number of individuals. You've often got the words joint and commissioning somewhere in their title. So it's almost as if that embodies the entirety of the relationship. And we feel the scope for a more fundamental and overarching relationship between local government and the NHS, within which things like joint commissioning or joint appointments or what have you are a byproduct of that broader relationship rather than the entirety of the relationship. And as part of that, we've argued local government needs the NHS now more than ever. Local government not only is struggling in terms of its resources, but it's tasked with promoting social and economic well-being, and it's tasked with being a strategic place shaper. A slightly odd phrase, but I guess it means that the one local institution that's responsible for identifying and nurturing the unique identity of an area. I live and work in Birmingham, and what's special about Birmingham? What makes Birmingham Birmingham, and how do we protect and nurture that for the long term? And how do we make it a better place to be born and to grow up and to go to school and to go to work and to live and to die? You know, the local authority and the services that it represents and the relationship that it has with local people is a strategic place shaper. And to do that well, it has to have a very strong relationship with the NHS, since health services are so important to so many different local people. However, I'd also contend that the NHS needs to learn from and work with the best of local government now more than ever, if it's going to have the legitimacy that it needs to make the very, very difficult decisions that we have to make and to implement those decisions effectively. It's often said stereotypically that the NHS is good at making the right decision. We have lots of data, we have lots of analytical capacity, we're quite logical and quite rational. If you give the NHS a decision to make, it will often make quite a rational, logical, technically defensible decision. It's good at making the right decision. It's often said, though, that local government is good at making decisions in the right kind of ways, in ways that bring people with you and maximise your chance of being able to implement the decision you've taken. I know that's a kind of cultural stereotype, if you like, but given some of the decisions that we will have to take about future services and funding, we need to make the right decisions, yes, but we also need to make those decisions in the right kind of ways, in ways that bring people with us as we try and implement those decisions. So back in an era of world-class commissioning, some time ago now, we were asked by a former primary care trust, how will we know if we're a successful world-class commissioner? And I remember saying, well, in one sense, you're probably world-class already, in the sense that nobody commissions systematically very well anywhere in the world. So if all you aspire to be is world-class, you're probably there already. And then realising that that was probably a fairly unhelpful and flippant answer, we slightly tongue-in-cheek said, well, maybe you're a world-class commissioner if when you take a really difficult decision, if you downgrade an A&E department, if you close a maternity unit, maybe you're a world-class commissioner if local people and the local media say, well, we either agree or we violently disagree with the decision that's been taken. But we recognise that the PCT, as was, that the CCG is now, is the locally legitimate organisation to take that very difficult decision on behalf of the local population. In one sense, it's as much about being seen as the legitimate organisation to do the thing as it is about the nature of the thing that we do. And in the current financial and policy context, that is going to be crucial. So if local government needs the NHS now more than ever, and if the NHS needs local government now more than ever, isn't the time right for a new relationship, maybe one that's based more around the notion of place than has been the case in the past, so that things like joint commissioning, joint working, some of the initiatives that we may be developing at local level are byproducts of that broader relationship rather than the entirety of that relationship.
Yes, and as John said, the local authorities have had a particularly difficult time of late with the financial austerity and the huge cuts to the services. But as you engage with local authorities and observe their thinking, what's been interesting as well is that they've almost developed a new sense of self and what their role and what their purpose is. And they've perhaps rethought their old relationship, where it's very much to do with we raise taxes, we have the money, we deliver the services, to saying, well, how do we work cooperatively with the different resources and people and communities in our area in order to achieve better outcomes for people who live there. And whilst in some ways it would be quite clear and quite sensible to do that, we can all get lost in the hurly-burly of having to deliver service and administer various duties. And this notion of place-based working has become a really strong philosophy within local authorities. And this definition that you've got on your slide now, I think nicely captures it. And this actually comes from Scotland, from somewhere called IRIS, which is a Centre for Health and Social Care Evidence. And it's by working collaboratively with the people who live and work locally. Place-based working aims to build a picture of the system from a local perspective, taking an asset-based approach that seeks to highlight the strengths, capacity and knowledge of those involved. And that really encapsulates, I think, the excitement in local government about we can't do things the way we used to do them, but we can do things better by working more collaboratively with the various community resources and assets that we have. And this does link very strongly with this notion of asset-based approaches. And this again is quite a philosophical step that underpins new ways of working within social care, in particular adult social care, and also within public health in terms of health prevention and or preventing ill health and working with people in terms of self-managing. And this really very much tries to shift from focusing on what is wrong with people and communities, providing a response to an identified problem, delivering services, emphasising the role and specialism of agencies, focusing on individuals as problems within difficult families, and seeing people really as very passive and people that have to be done to moving to more of an asset approach, which is the opposite of all those things that I've just said. And I think it's fair to say that local government would always have seen the importance of working in an asset way, but again, lost its underpinning philosophy through the kind of different roles that it had, etc. And I think public health has been very helpful in this regard as well. And in many local authorities, it's taken a bit of time for public health and the integration of that profession within the organisation, partly because they do come from a different basis in terms of evidence, in terms of skill base. But increasingly what we're seeing is that the synergies you can have between public health and social care and the wider local authority are starting to be realised in practice. And again, public health brings this notion of agency, of self-management, of people being more than their problems and being responsible for their own health and well-being. So it's quite a philosophical change that we've had within local authorities over recent years. In many ways, at the heart of this place-based approach within local authorities are health and well-being boards. And we thought this was quite a helpful initiative to consider, partly because they are really important parts of the population health management landscape currently, but also because the thinking that underpins health and wellbeing boards will reflect much of the thinking that many of you are doing as you try and plan your population health management approaches for a particular community or locality. So we'll do a little bit of recap of what exactly they are, and then we'll talk a little bit about what's the learning been of health and wellbeing boards having such a central role. And when they started health and wellbeing boards, they were launched in about 2012, and we weren't at that point thinking of population health. We were thinking more of integrated care and integrated working. And health and wellbeing boards were really given three key duties. The first was to undertake a joint strategic needs assessment of the local authority area. So thinking about the overall well-being of the population, thinking about the needs of particular populations, trying to understand health inequalities, both now but also in the future. So very much the strategic needs assessment should be thinking about 5 years, 10 years. You know, what are the major issues regarding health and well-being that has to be considered by local authority and its partners? They're then tasked with developing a strategy, again a joint strategy across health, social care and others in terms of responding to the main issues from the strategic needs assessment and promoting health and well-being. And they've also got a duty to secure integration where it is necessary to improve the quality of services or reduce inequalities. So they haven't got a catch-all duty to promote integration per se, but only when they feel it's going to improve quality of services or reduce health inequalities. And my hunch would be that if you think about the individual projects that you'll be working on in terms of your local areas, you will be undertaking a mini needs assessment. You'll be developing a plan which is almost a very defined health and wellbeing strategy for that population, and you'll be thinking about where's the fragmentation that affects your ability to promote health and wellbeing, and therefore you've got to address through your commissioning plans and or your delivery plans. And the quote at the top, the beating heart of population health, is adapted from a national study of health and wellbeing boards, which called it the beating heart of integrated care. So that notion that the centre of local authorities and its wider partnership, the Health and Wellbeing Board, should be there pulsating and generating and driving and supporting integrated work. So who's on the Health and Wellbeing Boards? Again, I'll do this quite quickly. So technically there are 6 statutory members of a Health and Wellbeing Board. It's chaired by a councillor, usually often the leader of the council or the cabinet member for health and social care. And that's important because it's that elected democratic membership of councils is what gives its unique flavour and its unique authority within the local area. We've got directors of adult services and directors of children's services, clinical commissioning groups as the health commissioners would be on the board, the Director of Public Health as the leader of that function, and also Local Health Watch, who were the representative of individual patients and the public at large. And those were the statutory members of Health and Wellbeing Boards, but beyond that, Health and Wellbeing Boards could decide to adopt more members if they so wish. And one of the big issues when Health and Wellbeing Boards first started out was, were they commissioners, and therefore should they keep that purity of role, or should they also include providers of the NHS services and also providers in the voluntary and community sector, and indeed private providers on the way that they worked. And initially many boards decided to stick as commissioners, but over time, more and more of them have included providers on the basis that actually we do need this system working across commissioning and providing if we're going to achieve change in practice. And when we think about the sort of broad international context, there's a whole set of literature that talks about how do we change a system, how do we make it more collaborative in the way that it approaches work between different sectors, and how do we make it so it's more focused on individuals and communities. And the diagram you're seeing now is something called the Rainbow Model, which was based on an extensive literature review and Delphi study and various stakeholder analysis. And what it said was that when we think about trying to change the way a system functions, we can't just think about the front line. Yes, we've got to think about the way that general practice operates, the way that social work operates, the way that providers deliver services and interact with people. But we've also got to think about the layers around that. We've got to think about the teams that they're based in, we've got to think about the professional bodies, we've got to think about their organisations, and we've got to think about the systems. And only if we consider those different layers of a local area will we actually achieve sustainable changes in practice. And health and wellbeing boards in this diagram can be very much seen as the system level. So they're there to oversee the way that organisations behave, the way they interact, to try and troubleshoot where we've got particular fragmentations that prevent change happening on the ground, and also to think where they can on how they incentivise and reward more collaborative behaviours. And then finally, just in terms of the backdrop for health and wellbeing boards, I think this is really interesting. So this was a slide that was produced by the Department of Health in about 2014. And it was talking about how do health and wellbeing boards operate. And if you look at this, the kind of flow from the top left of starting to think about what does our population in place look like, going through gathering evidence, finding out what people need, analysing progress in terms of future past plans, thinking about key priorities, and all the way around to commissioning and delivery. This again is very, very similar to some of the guidance that's been produced recently by population health management initiatives. So again, I think health and wellbeing boards are both got practice experience of how we do this already in the current context, as well as being important members of the local environment. And so what do we know about how health and wellbeing boards work then? And many of you will be setting up various steering groups or project groups which try and bring in a number of the partners that are involved in health and wellbeing boards. And there's been a series of publications from about 2013 by Shared Intelligence, which has looked at health and wellbeing boards and has observed a number of them in practice, and has also consulted with people who are members of them. And it produced a kind of a yearly update on health and wellbeing boards and how they're getting on. And what they identified in 2017 from all that work was a number of the success factors that will support more integrated working and also more of a population health management approach. And these are the 6 success factors that they recommend. The first is this idea of collaborative plumbing. So what that means is that you do need an infrastructure. You do need to accept that working together does require some processes. It does require some administrative support, and you don't want to over-bureaucratize, but you do need something that holds people to account and gives a collective sense of where you're at and what you're planning to do. The second thing they say is about effective leadership, and they're particularly focused in their work in health and wellbeing boards on political leadership. And it's one of the great mysteries, I think, for many people in the NHS as to what are counsellors and how do they operate, and how can you have somebody who has no background necessarily in a particular discipline actually making decisions about resource allocation and different ways of working. And that there is some truth in that criticism, but the other side of that is they actually have a democratic accountability, and they do care about where they come from and who they represent. So what Shared Intelligence say is that we've got to make sure that the people who undertake those democratic leadership roles understand the notion of population health management integrated care, but also that the leaders from the more executive, the more professional bases can also talk to them in the right language and frame things in the right way. The third thing they said was that you shouldn't be focusing on money, you shouldn't be focusing on activity per se. What you should be focusing on is the place. Because the place is the thing that ties us all together and will bind us and give us a common narrative. And it's also the place where we will find the assets that we can unlock and we can engage with as we try and work with different communities. So they thought place, whatever that place is, whether it's the large geography or a small community, was the thing that actually motivated people. The fourth thing was that the meetings and the formal boards are clearly important, but that's only part of the jigsaw. And that will be the same if you're developing a project group or a steering group for your population health management initiative. Yes, you do need to have times to formally get together, but actually to work well, what you need to do is to make it more than a meeting. You have to develop almost a network of people, of relationships, who've got a shared interest in a place, in a population, and who can develop some trust and an ability to challenge each other. So not only is it ideal if you've got time for formal meetings, but try and build in some time around those meetings or alongside those meetings where you can get to know each other as individuals. And sometimes that feels a little bit soft, but actually it's really important, and it can help you to address some of the hard issues that arise. The fifth thing was clarity of purpose. There's a well-trodden literature of such partnership vehicles in which we try and do far too much. We aspire to change the world in a very short time and with a very short number of resources. And actually, the work from Shared Intelligence in terms of health weighing boards says that you're much better having a smaller focus, a tighter purpose, and then you're going to achieve it. And finally, they initially had a guidance that said having the right geography. And then they realized that actually most people don't have the right geography, in that, you know, we know general practice works on practice populations, local authorities work on localities. We've got differences between ICSs and health and wellbeing boards, etc., etc. And so what they came up with was, well, actually, you just have to make it work. You have to accept if you've got 3 health and wellbeing boards for 1 SDP or ICS, you've got to make those health and wellbeing boards come together. So it's making the geography work, and it's being realistic about the context that you're in. So a different view of health and wellbeing boards is by David Hunter and his team at Durham University, who did the only large-scale evaluation of health and wellbeing boards. And what you get from academic research, obviously, is perhaps more of a critical eye to how such things work in practice. And this was the main findings that they published in 2018. The first was that this idea of yes, as commissioners, they have some levers, but actually what's important in health and wellbeing boards is that notion of soft power, of using their influence, their expertise, their legitimacy to actually convince people and to negotiate different change processes. So yes, you can use financial incentives, but only if they're along a broader picture of influence and negotiation. Where they didn't work, what they observed was it was a collection of leaders rather than a leadership body. So what that means is that it was leaders came together, but they didn't necessarily work together. So again, that's something to think about in your forums and steering groups that you're setting up. Are you starting to move beyond your individual interests, but actually move to more of a collective gain? As often comes up, yes, we've got Health Watch on board, but actually how meaningful was public and user involvement? And again, a lot of the work that we do at the University of Birmingham, where we support change programs, and people will know it's important, but always come to it too late in the day. And if there's one thing we would really emphasize, it's that you will get so much, so many insights and potentially useful challenge by getting that user involvement early on is very helpful. It's very easy to focus on practicalities, so money is always a blessing and a curse. So once we have money and we have a bit of budget to spend, that can actually overshadow some of the broader work that we need to do in terms of addressing the needs of a population. And this is what we find with health and wellbeing boards, that the Better Care Fund and some of the national expectations and performance management around that can actually take away some of the momentum that you could gain from a health and wellbeing board. There's then also dangers of how do you quantify the outcomes, and then concerns about overshadowing by various policies. And as you'll know, since health and wellbeing boards were set up, we've had SDPs, we're now got ICSs, and there's a danger that we always like to grab onto the latest initiative. The other side of that is that's the reality. There's always going to be change in policy, there's going to be change in local environments. And again, within your population health management, you have to try and have a degree of forecast of such changes, but also be flexible and work within your arrangements that came in. But what's interesting, what David Hunter and his team said was that even though there was these problems, these challenges, they were still seen as being important. People still recognised that having a forum to come together to talk about common interests across health and social care and the voluntary sector was really important. So where are we now? So now I think the health and wellbeing boards have moved beyond integrated care onto this sense of place. And there was a report out earlier this year from the Local Government Association on where are health and wellbeing boards in 2019. And what they felt was that the ones that were working well were providing this anchor of place. So it was pulling back the sort of local services and local leaders to think about and to be based in what the local context was and the local populations. And we're therefore helping to connect the neighbourhood, the place and the system. And the Local Government Association have published a number of good case examples of health and wellbeing boards. And one I think that comes out particularly strongly is in Coventry and Warwickshire. And if there's anyone from Coventry and Warwickshire on the webinar, it'd be great to hear if you agree with this assessment. And in Coventry and Warwickshire, this was one of the areas in which the SDP footprint didn't fit neatly in with a single health and wellbeing board. What you've got is 2 health and wellbeing boards, one in Coventry, one in Warwickshire, who are linked with the same SDP. So rather than just avoid that contextual issue and just try and work in a separate way, they came together with the SDP and said, look, how do we get the most out of our collective interests and resources? And they've developed this really interesting joint concordance where they've asked the health and wellbeing boards and the STP and the other major organisations in the region to sign up as a joint understanding for how they're going to work together. So things like a focus on prevention, an emphasis on place, on looking for opportunity. And then they bring together a wider group of stakeholders through holding regular place forums, which are open to the voluntary sector, to advocacy groups and others, to try and come together and have some open and shared dialogue, which I think is a really nice way of doing it. And then as the first major undertaking of under this joint concordance, they've launched a year of wellbeing, in which they're promoting the ideas of well-being and looking after yourself and various preventative means, which again I think is a nice output from their collaboration together. So where do we get to in all this then? So the first thing is that local government is an absolutely vital partner for population health management. It's very hard to think of any aspect of population health management that will not touch upon local government. And indeed, not just local government, but also that wider voluntary community sector that we have in our local places. Yes, local government is configured differently to the NHS, and yes, this can be frustrating in some ways, but actually this can be complementary. As John said at the beginning, the NHS may be very good at, as it often is, in terms of making a rational decision based on evidence, but local authorities are generally better at understanding the political, the small p relationships, the dynamics, and trying to work with those so that you can actually make change happen in practice. So it might be frustrating and seem uncertain to begin with, but actually understanding that difference is going to give us the best outcome. The new public health responsibilities have further strengthened local government's commitment and expertise in working with populations. And indeed, public health's understanding of evidence, I think, has really supported that broader role of local government. Health and wellbeing boards themselves are far from perfect, and some work better than others, as is often the way, but they still have an important role. And unlike SDPs and ICSs, these are actually legal bodies with legal duties, and they're actually they have to be part of the local environment. And finally, looking at health and wellbeing boards, well, it gives us important lessons for some of the work that you'll be undertaking. You should try to bring together local government and the local NHS organisations around populations. And I think that's the end of our presentation. John, any final words that you'd like to share as we come to the end of the webinar?
I suppose I'll just go back to some of what I was saying earlier about understanding each other's worlds, that working in both local government and the NHS, I often come across situations where people have become senior by being experts in their own system and their own directorates and their own area of specialism, and actually a number of the things that we've been talking about today are dependent upon understanding other people and other partner organisations, and in a busy environment and in a very difficult policy and financial context, often difficult to take the time to further and deepen that understanding. But actually time spent alongside others understanding how other things work, I think is really time really well spent and an important contribution. So there's some practical lessons from health and wellbeing boards, for example, about how we might work together around some of the projects that you'll be working on and so on. But actually the process of working alongside partners and understanding the same issues from other people's perspectives is a really important part of the process as well, and probably deepens and enriches how we might otherwise go about our work.
Great. Okay, thanks, John, and thanks to all of you for joining us. As John said, at the end of a busy day, no doubt. Do send us through any questions you've got. You can find us at the University of Birmingham website, and John and I will both be part of future events around population health management. So thanks for listening, and have a good rest of the week. Thank you very much.
Take care. Good evening.